Welcome back and thank you for staying with us. We have come to the final session of the day, which is a panel on readiness for EVs, where our panel speaker will be discussing the future of electric vehicles in Asia region. The panel discussion will begin with each of the panelists briefly introducing themselves and sharing a little bit of their backgrounds. We will then kick it off by addressing the questions submitted by our delegates to us even prior to the program. The floor is also open for everyone here to raise your questions anytime. If you would like to speak in person, please click the raise hand icon so we can hand you the microphone. Alternatively, you may type your questions in the Q&A box on the right side of your screen. Do let us know if you would like to direct your questions to a specific panelist. Our moderator, Mr. Aman Modi, is the partner of Boston Consulting Group in Singapore. Mr. Modi has 15 years of total experience in the energy industry across the value chain, including power, renewables, fuel and non-fuel retail, and oil and gas. He has worked extensively across Southeast Asia, Middle East, Europe, Central Asia, and the US on a range of topics from strategy and innovation to operation, organization, and new business build. The panel will also be joined by Mr. Nuki Utama, the Executive Director of ASEAN Center for Energy, Indonesia. Ms. Joanna Heckman, the Head of Charging Infrastructure of PT Group, Germany. Mr. Evan Beaver, the Head of Charging of ChargeFox, Australia. I will now pass the stage to Mr. Modi to continue with the panelist introductions. Thank you, Mr. Modi.
Good afternoon, everyone. So thank you again for attending this session today. Just before we get going, 2020 was the inflection year for electric vehicles. It is now one of the hottest topics that's on everyone's mind. You see it everywhere in the stock market valuation of EV companies, proliferation of EV brands that you see on streets, policy announcements that governments are making, as well as moves that multiple companies are making. So technology is proven, it's commercialized, but we are now at a point of scaling, and a lot of enablers are required to make sure that EVs can reach their full potential. So the question is, how is the current EV hype going to convert into reality? Are we ready for this? And that's what our distinguished panel today is going to help us decipher. Let me briefly introduce the panelists. We have with us Dr. Nuki Agyautama. Dr. Nuki is the Executive Director of ASEAN Center for Energy. He works directly with the Governing Council of the ASEAN Center for Energy, which comprises ministries of all the member states. He's also on the advisory board of Asia Pacific Energy Research Center, as well as the World Economic Forum Global Future Councils. So thank you for being here, Dr. Nuki. We also have with us Johanna Heckman. Johanna is the Head of Charging Infrastructure for P3 Group. Johanna has been working in e-mobility since 2012. And Johanna joined P3 Group in 2015 in the area of EV charging. She leads a team of 40 technology consultants globally and focuses on business model and strategy topics such as market entry for different customers in the energy, automotive, and the charging industry. Thanks, Johanna, for being here. And finally, last but not the least, we also have Evan with us. Evan Beaver is the Head of Charging for ChargeFox. ChargeFox is the largest Australian charging network operator. Evan is somewhat of a pioneer in the field, having set up the DC network for Tesla in Australia between 2014 and 17, and now he's replicating that success at ChargeFox. Thank you, Evan, for being here. So without much ado, what we will do is we will hear from our panelists in turn, and then we will have the opportunity to ask some questions from them. Let me invite Dr. Nuki to get us going and speaking about the readiness for EVs in the APAC and ASEAN region.
Yes, thank you very much, Aman, for the nice introductions. Good afternoon, everyone, and perhaps good evening and also good morning to all of the audience. Right away on the, according to our ASEAN Energy Outlook, the AO6, which is published last year, in 2017, the transportation sector was responsible for 26% of the total final energy consumption in ASEAN. And 80% of those are coming from gasoline and diesel consumption. It was also responsible for 23% of the region GHG emission on that particular year. The ASEAN member state also realized the need to reduce oil import dependency, to improve energy security, and address challenges associated with fossil fuel vehicles, including GHG emission, and of course, indeed, the local pollution. The adoption of electricity vehicles and substitution of oil products with biofuel can be also the two key approach for more sustainable transportation sectors in the region. And then from the technology perspective, the price of lithium-ion batteries, the key component of EV, is predicted to keep falling. And some studies have even shown that a certain environment, the levelized cost of driving EVs can be comparable to fossil fuel vehicles. And in fact, the improvement of the technology and rapid growing on the demand of the transportation sectors, especially the private vehicles, will also giving very big opportunities for EV in the region. I think the game changer for higher EV penetration is the near term will be the electrification of public and commercial transportation. The electrification of public transport could become the pilot cases. Also, the industry could make use of this opportunity to push out EV models that are affordable yet reliable in the municipal areas. And according to our report, the post-COVID-19, people might have preferences of private transport. Synergizing EV with green recovery, renewable energy, and battery strategies will be very critical. I think that's the entrance introduction coming from my side. Aman, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nuki. I think let me just briefly summarize what we are saying is that in our region, transport is a big component of the energy consumption. And given the reliance on fossils, it poses challenges on both sustainability as well as on the import-export balance for a lot of countries in our region. And as a consequence, EV, but also biofuel is a real alternative. And you know, perhaps the electrification of public transport can be a very concrete starting point. Thank you, Dr. Nuki. Let me invite Johanna now to talk about the overall status of charging infrastructure as one of the key enablers, as well as particularly the market situation in Europe as well as internationally, from which we may have some learnings for our region.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone from Germany. Very happy to be part of this conference and introduce a little bit the, let's say, global and international perspective on EVs and EV charging infrastructure. So at P3, we set up a basic model which is considering the CO2 compliance targets, and then from that forecasts the EV roadmap and let's say development also on a global level. And we expect from that model that we will meet a share of new registration of up to 30% globally in 2030, which results in a stock of 160 million EVs worldwide. And of course, the leading regions to drive that transition towards electric mobility are China, Europe, the US, but of course also the other countries have developed their roadmaps and their let's say steps on how to implement electric mobility in the future. And just recently, VW, one of the biggest automotive manufacturers, held its Power Day, where they of course introduced the roadmap towards more electric vehicles, towards cheaper battery technology, a more competitive setup of the whole powertrain, and also, of course, the industrialization of the whole portfolio. But the second biggest topic in the whole Power Day was charging and the integration of electric mobility into the overall ecosystem, the overall energy system. And I think this is also one of the main challenges and one of the most necessary drivers that are necessary to be able to realize the transition towards electric mobility, to ensure that there's enough charging infrastructure. And we see, coming from a point where first pilot projects have been conducted, first sites have been established, also lots of funding programs are available in the market. We now really need to scale up charging infrastructure. We need to offer more professional, more standardized offers that are also then meeting the customer requirements. And also here we did some studies, let's say, also on the business factor charging infrastructure, because here a whole new business segment is developing according from our perspective, with lots of stakeholders from automotive industry, energy industry, oil and gas companies that are going into the market. And also here we expect to meet, let's say, substantial economic potential. Alone in Europe, we see annual value potential of up to or of more than 30 billion euro in 2030, and a comparable number also in the US. So I think it's very important to also consider charging infrastructure as a business segment, consider what are most suitable business models, and how to realize and enable the transition towards electric mobility by offering
in EVs taking off, 30% penetration of new vehicles, 160 million vehicles on the streets, led by US, China, and Europe. But of course, you see that growth reaching other places. And what was interesting to hear also is that not only are we talking about the Teslas and the Neos of the world, but the Volkswagens of the world are they starting to take interest. And even for them, beyond batteries themselves and the powertrains, the second most important topic, the key enabler, is charging. And beyond being an enabler itself, it's a business in its own right, with 30 billion euros of potential, as you just mentioned, in a few select markets, and it's a real opportunity for several of our current incumbents as well as others to pursue. Thank you very much, Johanna. Let me now invite Evan to talk through grid networks and systems and processes, how ready they are for mass EVs. Evan?
Yeah, thanks, Armin. Yeah, we got a nice question when we were preparing for this, of asking if are the grids ready? We call them distribution network service providers here. Are the DNSPs ready to accept the loads of EV charging? I've been focused since probably 2014 on the sharp end, on the deployment side of EV charging, choosing the hardware and deciding where to put it. And I'd say, as in a general comment, that yes, the networks are ready. They're EV chargers are just another electrical load. The networks are ready to have electrical loads connected. They have systems and processes in place to guide that through safely. In Australia, I often say to people that the question often comes up, is there enough energy or is there enough power in the grid for people to buy EVs? And it's an easy answer in Australia. Every car needs 2 kilowatts of solar panels, and then their load will be covered every day. The difficulty in EV charging infrastructure is that when you're building a charging site, it flips the relationship between property and the electricity connection. If I was building a shopping centre, I would have the land and I could understand what the cost to connect that shopping centre was, and that would be 5-10% of the build of that site. And you would just do that. That would be the normal thing to do. But with an EV charging station, the connection from the main switchboard down is more than half the price of the station build. So we've got to change the relationship from, we have a piece of land, how much does it cost to connect it? Flip that to, let's find the cheapest place to connect. Can we figure out how to get the land there? And where I think the network operators aren't ready for EV charging is for them to flip that relationship rather than receiving a request from us that says we would like a connection here for 500 kVA, please. It's more along the lines of we've got 6 choices, which one will be the cheapest to build? I've been working on that problem for about 6 years in Australia, and a couple of the networks are getting there. There's 12 others that need to pick up their game, but that's where I put a lot of my effort into the next few years. Thanks, Armin.
Thank you very much, Evan. So very, very interesting observations. I captured that you feel the amount of power that is needed is there. Networks are ready. You said 2 kilowatts of solar panels per car, and then they're resolved forever, which is a very, very interesting statistic. But of course, the problem that is still unsolved is the cost of connection to the charger, which is where a lot of future effort is required. So thank you, Evan. Thank you again, Johanna and Dr. Nuki. So what we will do now is we have already received several questions from our attendees for the session, and let me just run through these questions in turn. But in the meanwhile, for all attendees, if you have additional questions, then please feel free to either chat them, put them in the chat, or raise hand, and we will take your question. So perhaps let me start with the first question for Dr. Nuki. Dr. Nuki, do we have a view on projections of EV in the next few years, especially in the Southeast Asia region, and also whether you have a view on whether it's going to be battery EV, which is very highly prevalent today, versus hydrogen as a fuel? So it would be great, Dr. Nuki, to hear your point of view, and of course, then Johanna, Evan, if you have anything to add, happy to take that as well.
Yes, thank you, Aman. It is quite tough question at the moment if you talk about the Southeast Asia because of highly dependency in our transportation sector towards the fossil fuel. But I want to let you know that the current early stage of the EV adoption, for example, in Thailand, from the forefront in terms of EV share of total vehicle stock, with sales rising in 2017, and by the end of 2019, Thailand already had 19,000 EV in various kind of type of vehicles. In the Philippines itself, in 2018 is around 4,500 and increased to 6,000 this year. Malaysia just over 5,500 and Singapore around 1,500 in this current year. So if you're looking at the early stage in Southeast Asia and the numbers spread throughout the ASEAN member states, and also the interest on having more private vehicles after COVID-19, I think feeling for the people to really looking forward on the PV. And the case of Indonesia itself, I think the government already launched a strategy to increase the penetration of PV, especially due to the oversupply of the electricity happening in the main island of Java, Bali, and Madura. We do have a national grid, the biggest national grid. We call it Java, Madura, and Bali. And currently it's oversupply, and the government already prepare some national plan to increase the share of PV. Yeah, I believe it is very promising.
Thank you, Dr. Nuki. Johanna, from an international point of view beyond Southeast Asia, ASEAN, any point of view? You mentioned earlier about EV penetration, so happy to hear from you how you see the curve bending.
Yes, so I think we clearly have to differentiate between different vehicle segments and different markets. For sure, we see in Europe currently that there's a strong trend toward battery electric cars and passenger cars. Also the electrification of commercial vehicles. Also, heavy-duty trucks is starting, but also here there's a stronger, let's say, still struggle whether it will be battery and or fuel cell. And from our expectation, we see that in the commercial vehicle sector, there will be a stronger mix of different technologies, also given that there's a high variety of different use cases and customer requirements. But for passenger vehicles, at least for the European market, I think that the battery electric vehicles and the powertrain already won the race, and that all the major automotive manufacturers really go for that that technology in the future.
Thank you, Johanna. I have the next question is also for you, Johanna. Based on your experience in other markets as well, do you see what do you see as the potential for EVs in non-urban environments?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So of course, I think the first priority development regions for electric mobility are metropolitan areas, big cities, also due to regulation like driving bans and emission regulation that force the drivers to change towards electric mobility. But especially also, like from my perspective in Europe, and I think that can be transferred to other markets, also the non-urban environments are very suitable for electric mobility, because here you have the possibility to integrate local generation into the ecosystem. Also the, let's say, annual mileage are totally manageable for electric mobility already today. And if you consider, for example, the availability of charging infrastructure, then you could also say that in non-urban environments, the share of residential charging and the accessibility to an own parking lot where you then also have charging infrastructure might be more convenient even. So that's why we, for example, in Germany, have also dedicated funding also goes hand in hand with the change in the metropolitan areas, then it's a good situation, because of course also if there's a comprehensive change and an overall change, then it makes sense.
Fantastic, thank you, Johanna. So is it fair to say that it's probably not the top priority, and even when it happens, it requires some degree of support in policy terms and so on and so forth to drive it? Is that a fair summary, or would you say it's more self-driving?
I think it is more self-driving, but of course, as I said, it depends on the market and the country. I mean, in Europe, we have a totally different infrastructure also in the rural areas available, where you have more single-family homes, more more private people having the availability to also afford charging infrastructure. Absolutely. When it comes more to development countries, I think, of course, then the situation is different.
Fantastic, thank you. Evan, maybe I'm also curious to hear your view on this in Australia, quite a large country, well spread out and so on. How does it work in Australia?
Yeah, it's something I talk to people about socially quite a lot. People, they say, we live in a huge country, I can't buy an EV. I think a lot of that idea comes from a sort of a misunderstanding about how people use cars. So we've got a 2014 model Nissan Leaf that can do 100 kilometres between charges. And then we've got an old petrol Nissan X-Trail that we leave parked out the front of the house. We drive the X-Trail about once a month. We drive the Leaf every day. It does 99% of our driving. It's a cheap car. It's really cheap to run. It's really reliable. I think that a lot of people in rural areas imagine that they live in a rural area means they drive hundreds of kilometres, where in fact, day to day, they just drive around their town, they drive around their location. And then once a month, once every 3 months, they might travel in between cities. So we've been calling this the 8-wheel hybrid approach. So you keep your old petrol car and just get a cheap electric runabout. There's lots of cars under $20,000 now that are quite reasonably priced and cost effective for most households.
Fantastic. I live in Singapore. A $20,000 car would be a dream for me, given our extraordinary taxes on the cars. But that's besides the point. Maybe the next question for Dr. Nuki. Dr. Nuki, how would one measure the readiness of a country to go on this electric vehicles growth?
I think the most important is the infrastructure, and also the policy should be ready enough to capture this potential. In line with those two major elements, the grid penetration on the providing the enough supply on this increasing of the demand. If we're looking at the penetration of EV suddenly coming next year, for example, then the grid will be having some issues. So that's something that the government need to think ahead, and the effect on the power grid, as I mentioned, and also analyzed by the McKinsey, the EV market show that EV has not been a burden, in fact, on the electricity grid. But in Southeast Asia, the electricity grid that we have currently is somehow having an old infrastructure that I'm aware of, and we need to do some sort of further studies on that matters. How we can also incorporate the renewable energy source on the grid. Otherwise, we're going to have the same thing again, because most of our power generation is generated coming from the fossil fuel. Then the issues of green supply will not be there. The issues of EV will increase the cleaner air or reducing the climate change will not be also an issue. So a lot of things that need to be done in the region in that particular sense.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nuki. I think we have time for just a couple more questions. Maybe one for Evan. Evan, what should be the first priority for setting up the infrastructure? Should it be electricity powered mass transportation or private owned EVs? What can scale drive the right utilization quickly?
It's a tricky question. I was thinking about this one before the conference. It's I think, given if you're in a situation where the government is motivated and the communication strategies are good and it is physically possible, that mass transit is a better option in most cities. I think that most experts, and I'm interested to hear what Johanna says, but I think most experts would say that that's the way to achieve mass mobilisation. The caveat comes in somewhere like Australia, and I think the US is similar, where people don't like public transport. They really like private vehicles. And so then the question is less about how do we achieve the most clean kilometres, becomes about personal motivation, less than what is the best policy response. I think in a policy response, the most successful ones in Australia have been to demonstrate electrification between the big cities. If you can see that you can drive from Sydney to Melbourne, that's a powerful thing for people, and that will start to get people to use it. The comparable project would have been fast rail from Sydney to Melbourne, and that's been talked about for 20 years and is a $30 billion project. So I don't know, it's a hard one to answer. We've found some success in electrifying private transport. I think you could probably get more bang for your buck with mass transit, but there's other barriers that stop mass transit getting taken up.
Thank you, Evan. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask one last question to Johanna, which is, what are the costs of EV infrastructure development for developing countries?
Yes, so I think the interesting thing about charging infrastructure is that along the, let's call it value chain, there's some elements that are highly scalable and can also be scaled on a global level, such as the hardware devices, also the software that is necessary to manage and operate the charging infrastructure and so on. On the other hand, this market is shaped to a large extent by very local requirements. And I think we touched already on that especially the cost for grid connection and also to set up a suitable grid connection might be the biggest roadblocker also for development countries to really set up a comprehensive charging network. I think also Evan might be an expert on that, because that especially is true for fast charging infrastructure. So I think it is very necessary to see, and that also relates to the question that you just asked to Evan, what might have the highest impact in those countries. And this might also be the most interesting and most relevant topic for the public authorities to see, like, how can we reduce emissions best? How can we target the biggest, let's say, audience with the electrification to also take away the user constraints? And I think based on that, it's really hard to say a specific cost, because that differs from country to country and from strategy to strategy. But it is, from my perspective, very important to have a very efficient usage of resources in those markets, and also see like what kind of effects and impacts can be reached with that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Johanna. And given the
sorry to interrupting. Yeah, actually, we have one question from Juhasman here. It's regarding, does the increasing numbers of EVs increase the number of charging stations, or does the growth of charging stations would encourage more EVs in the market?
Maybe I'll ask Evan to take this, and then Johanna.
Yeah, it's a good chicken and egg question. I think at the start of the transition, the second half is more true, that you need to build chargers to let people feel confident to go and buy an EV. I think once we get to a certain level of penetration, I assume at some point in the future, our chargers will become profitable, at which point the market starts to push, and then EVs coming generate more EV charging.
Yeah, totally agree to Evan. Just one minor addition to that. I think also the rollout timelines differ, and the rollout timelines for charging infrastructure due to permissions, necessary civil engineering and so on might be much longer. And that's why it's necessary to really be a little bit ahead with the charging infrastructure all the time, just to ensure that there's no mismatch after a while, because the rollout timelines are just a bit longer than the, let's say, delivery of the EVs.
Fantastic. Weslin, are there any additional questions?
There will be. That's it for the additional questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here with us today. So, are there any final thoughts that everyone would like to add before we end the sessions here?
I would like to just say thank you to all the panelists for sharing, your very insightful experiences, thoughts on this very important topic, and to the attendees for sending across questions, some of which were clearly quite challenging and very, very relevant in the current times. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us on the day 3 of Power Week Asia. For tomorrow's session, we will be discussing the power and energy projects development in Asia region. I look forward to seeing you again at the same time, same link tomorrow.